Good evening, everyone. And welcome to the University of St. Thomas Summer Literary Series. I am your host, James Matthew Wilson. Tonight, we celebrate, in keeping with the various strands and stories that run through history, beginnings, middles, and ends. The beginning is that tonight marks the second night of the Master of Fine Arts summer residency, the second of 10 days, so we're still at the beginning. The middle. This is the middle event of our summer literary series, which began on the 16th, on Bloomsday, with a reading from Joshua Wren of his new novel, and continued the next night with a poetry reading by the Irish poet Micheál O'Siadhail, and was continued again last night by a wonderful keynote reading by one of our guests tonight, by Dana Gioia. But this is also an end, because as nearly everybody in this room knows, the Master of Fine Arts program that is the organizing body of this event and is the occasion for so many of us gathering together tonight was first conceived in the entirely impractical mind of Joshua Wren. And after gracing us for the last week with that very impractical mind, it is going to fly back to Milwaukee, and it will take with it all our blessings and our good wishes. So thank you, Joshua, for I want to say thank you for your presence here among us. We know how exhausting life is, and for children, and for your wisdom and teaching to the students during the Summer Writers Institute, and also for this initial inspiration that brings us all here tonight. So thank you, Joshua. Our guests tonight for this public conversation are Dana Gioia and Robert Royal, and I'm going to say just a few brief words about each of them. Dana Gioia is an internationally acclaimed poet and writer. He is former California Poet Laureate and chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. Born in Los Angeles of Italian and Mexican descent, he received his BA and MBA from Stanford and an MA from Harvard in comparative literature. He also worked for many years as a businessman before becoming a full-time writer, and to many of us will be known for the great work he did as a public intellectual during his years at the National Endowment for the Arts, where he began many programs that have been a leaven to American literary culture. Our other guest tonight is Robert Royal, who is the editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing and president of the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C. Now, I will have much to say about both of these fellows during the course of this evening, but it's worth just sharing a brief list of some of Robert's books. They include Columbus and the Crisis of the West. Oh, but I've lost the title of your Dante book. What is it, Robert? Divine Comedy, Divine Spirituality, on Dante's Divine Comedy, and a book that I will be referring to in just a few minutes, A Deeper Vision, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century. Now, I have promised, before saying anything else about what we're going to be doing this evening, that I would turn things over to Dana, who has a story to tell. Please use your microphone.
Please indulge me. This story will actually lead somewhere. I started publishing or entering literary life, ironically, when I was at Stanford Business School. I'd gone there to be a poet, and I spent 3 hours every day working on writing and reading. And it was also the first time I really met writers. Now, simultaneously with this, as a Catholic, I was alienated at that point. I would go to Mass in the Bay Area. The liturgy was a mess. And I would sit through Mass dutifully, and I felt that my church no longer had a place for me. the only Catholics I met, this is in the early 70s, believed in liberation theology and radical Marxism. They were in love with Latin American revolution. I mean, they were about to canonize Che Guevara. And so that didn't feel that there was any place for me there. I went off to New York. I began working in business. I had no affiliation with any literary organization. I didn't publish for a number of years, but I continued to write every day. And I continued, in a sense, to try to connect to my Catholicism, which was central to me, but it felt almost like it was a kind of hermetism. And I began to publish, and I was put together a book of translations from Italian poetry. The sound's getting funky. Including at one point, because I couldn't find a nice translation of it, St. Benedict's hymn, The Virgin Mary, from the Paradiso. And I sent it off to a magazine to publish, to a secular magazine. This is the passage that begins, Vergine Madre, Figlia del suo figlio, O Virgin Mother, daughter of your son. And I hadn't published a book yet, published a number of articles, but I was a negligible figure. And I got a letter from a man named Robert Royal, whom I didn't know. And he had discerned, I wanted his autograph. And he asked me about my Catholicism in a very tasteful way, but he noticed this and he liked this. And if I was a Catholic, perhaps I would like to meet him if I was in Washington. And I was in Washington a lot. And so I went in and I talked to him. And he then invited me to a round table of Catholic writers that I don't know if he was organizing, but had input in it. And indeed, there were people who almost as loony as the people from San Francisco there. But there was also deeply intellectual, traditional Catholics who were intellectually alert. And I realized that my tribe did exist. I was, the people I'd been wandering to find were there. And he invited me to another conference. And this was the first steps of me, in a sense, being able to take my literary personality that was entirely in a secular literary world and my spiritual identity and putting them together. I would not be here, I think, without Robert Royal, which I think, Joshua and James, means that none of us would be here tonight. And so I want to acknowledge Robert as the only begetter, as Shakespeare would say, of this papist convocation, and I want to thank him publicly.
I don't remember it that way, but I'll tell you with the real truth later.
That is the appropriate story with which to begin, because the reason that we are here tonight is to take a moment to contemplate what is at stake in talking about Catholicism and literature, and indeed about American culture more generally. Our Master of Fine Arts program was founded on the premise that good literature depends deeply on the insights, both metaphysical and theological, that come from any profound vision of things, but especially and particularly from the Catholic vision of things, which takes everything whole and sees it whole. And when I think of all of us assembled here, what we're hoping to do, as everyone who wishes to participate in a culture must do, is to participate in a conversation. Armies move by force, but culture and the spirit move always by discussion, which is unfortunate in a cacophonous age such as ours, but it's nonetheless always going to be the truth. And so what I'm hoping we can do together tonight is to bring these two personalities together to think a little bit about both the past and the future of American and of Catholic letters and how these two things intersect. It's natural to have both Bob and Dana here tonight because when Joshua and I were given permission to create from nothing this program, well, not from nothing, right? That's to make something, anyhow. The two books that I had on my desk and that had been sitting on my desk as a continuous reference point for the previous year, maybe longer, were The Catholic Writer Today by Dana Gioia and A Deeper Vision, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century by Robert Royal. Rather than try to explain to you why these books are important, I thought I would put their authors on the spot a little bit and ask them to say something about it. So, Dana, if we could begin with you, with The Catholic Writer Today, I know it was a work of many years, but can you tell us a little bit of the genesis and what finally compelled you both to write the essay that became the cornerstone of that book and then to gather the book as a whole?
Fairly early in my career as a critic, I felt that given my life, I could never write a book like Robert's, which is a continuous book-length narrative. What I could do would be to write essays, to take an idea and develop it. And I felt that, I could try to do that better than anyone else. Now, what this does is you're never writing a book. The books have to sort of come into existence. So when I brought out Can Poetry Matter, the one or two pieces that I'd written that were Catholic didn't fit into it. When I did my book on British poetry, well, didn't really work there. And when I did Disappearing Ink, well, one or two sort of fit in. But I realized that I had these things, and then I wrote Catholic Writer Today as a kind of call to action to Catholic artists and intellectuals. And it began as a series of talks. And every time I gave the talk, we'd have question and answers. And people would ask me questions that I realized needed to be answered in the essay. So I kept developing it. And I would encourage you, if you want to be a serious essayist, to do that. But never, ever convince the transcript of your talk with the transcript of your essay. Because one's written for vocal delivery and the other's written for the page. And so I worked on it and I had this piece, and then I realized I could make a book around it, which then, me being as neurotic as I am, required me to rewrite from top to bottom every other piece, so it ended up where it did. Then I ended up with that little personal memoir called Singing Aquinas in Los Angeles. And so it was really, the book was consciously shaped as a major revision of both pre-existing pieces and new pieces. But, if you're going to do a book of essays, it has to be they all have to be good.
I've got to ask a little follow-up to that. I mentioned last night the Everything You Need to Know About Dana Gioia essay I wrote years ago, everything within 1,000 words. And the premise there was that you had managed to say something to upset everybody. And you wrote about poetry.
True.
Poetry and business, poetry and democracy, cowboy poetry. I'm actually losing. You even wrote a long tributary essay to Longfellow. So I guess what I'm wondering, Dana, is are you just looking to irritate people, or is there a deeper...
No, it's really quite simple. If you are in a broken culture that is increasingly becoming an ignorant, broken culture, almost anything that you do that's any good is going to upset them. Any position you take that you think is a true position is probably going to be, in some case, in opposition. So, but see, I'll tell you the advantage you have if you want to be critics. There are huge, magnificent topics that nobody's addressing, that either nobody's written on or nobody's written on for 100 years. And so, you can do something that, a foundational essay. I mean, I was asked to write a chapter for the Columbia History of American Poetry. And I said, I want to write on Robert Frost. And Jay Perini, the editor, said, no, I'm writing his biography, so I'm writing it. And he says, what else do you want to do? And I said, well, somebody's probably taken Eliot. And they go, yeah. I said, I want Longfellow. And Jay fell to his knees and embraced me, weeping. And he says, because he'd been trying to get somebody to write, no one would write on Longfellow. And so I wrote this piece, which, essentially revived Longfellow studies. And it's not because my essay was so good, which it is, but it was because it was a big, obvious topic. It's, one of the most important poets in American history, as well as one of the most unique and interesting figures in American history. And people had pretended he, didn't exist. And so, there are a bunch of topics on this. I'm going to give you a couple tonight. So,
So, Robert, over to you. I'm actually not quite sure how to frame this question, because when I was reading for the first time A Deeper Vision, I kept walking up to my wife at 11 o'clock at night and saying, I'm just not quite sure it's possible that somebody wrote this book. It's such a magisterial and comprehensive account of the 20th century Catholic mind that that most people would never dare undertake it. So rather than asking something very specific, just tell us what led you to finally write that book, and of some of the travails perhaps that went into it.
Well, I'd like to think it was the Holy Spirit whispering in my ear, but there probably were other motivations as well. I don't know that anyone's ever asked me that question, and if I had to kind of put it in accessible terms, what I would say is we sponsored at Faith and Reason Institute for about 20 years now what we call Fides et Ratio conversations. And these are, there are about 20 or 30 people who come together for a week-long seminar. These are faculty, administration, staff at various Catholic colleges and universities. Randy Smith, who's here, has been coming for years and helped us out with some of the seminars that we ran. And one of the things that I started to notice with year after year of highly, highly intelligent, committed Catholics, intellectuals, is that they didn't know anything about one another's disciplines. And my PhD is in comparative literature also. I mean, I spent a lot of my life reading languages, and I actually learned, whenever I tell theologians and philosophers this, they look at me strangely like, really? I actually learned about Aristotle and St. Thomas because I wanted to read Dante better. It's true. That poem led me to kind of moderate realism and whatnot. So I decided that I was going to write this book that was going to connect some of the conversations that we were having. And I've been reading into this material as an amateur. I mean, as a pure amateur philosophy, theology for 40 years, 45 years. And I discovered, I'd call up a friend of mine at Notre Dame who's a philosopher, and I would say, hey, what's the best history of Catholic philosophy in the 20th century? Well, there isn't one really. Well, there's a history of Thomism, but there's not, personal. So the more I dug into this, it became clear to me that while there were very, very good intellectuals working in specific fields, there was no Catholic thing, if I can use that expression, out there. By the way, someone asked me the other night why they named the Catholic thing, and I keep telling people about this. It's from Hilaire Belloc once wrote a letter to G.K. Chesterton, and he said, I am by inclination a skeptic. I am very sensual, and my sensualism overrides my reason, but I know that it's like reading an ordnance map. If I feel like I'm hiking and it's 20 kilometers, and the map says it's only 10, then it's really 10. And he says, I have to submit to that authority. And he said, that's how the church is for me. God made it, and it made me. A thing, not a theory, it. So that's the Catholic thing, a thing, not a theory. So I began, just assembling into my various readings over the years and doing the first philosophy and then theology, scripture studies, literature, etc. And somehow miraculously it all came together. It's very long and could have been twice as long. And I'm working on an American version of that right now. But the reason that I really knew that this was, in some sense, inspired is I was finishing the corrections on that book, is that massive manuscript that I had, in Rome. My wife was there with me. We'd taken an apartment for a month or two. And one day my wife's an icon painter. She went off to study some iconography. And while she was gone, I started my computer. I went to brew myself a cup of coffee, and my computer burned down. It's never happened to me before. But I know the wiles of the devil. And I'd make sure that every day I'd back this entire set of corrections on a disk. And so I went over to the Catholic News Service, and they were perfectly happy to let me use their computer. And I just kept, I wanted it to be readable too. You don't have to be a philosopher or a scripture scholar or a literary scholar to read it. I wanted it to be something that showed the richness of this tradition that we have that almost no one is aware of. It's, as Chesterton says, some things are so big you can't see them. So I'm glad you found your way into that. And a lot of other people tell me that too. So it was labor, well taken up, but it was strange. It was strange to have gone on that journey with that book.
So the book has two halves. I would just ask a kind of a quick question about the first half, which is whose subject is just what one would expect hearing about the Catholic intellectual tradition of the 20th century, which is Catholic philosophy and theology. And so I'm just remembering how particularly valuable the accounts of Edith Stein and of John Paul II, and actually of Karl Rahner were. And in fact, those three treatments really speak well of the quality of the book because they're at once appreciative yet critical. I've just named those three. Is there one section of that first half on philosophy and theology that you thought that you really knocked it out of the park, that was especially important?
James, you're inviting me to be immodest here. I'm glad you noticed that. I gave a copy of that book to a cardinal in Rome, not an American cardinal, a cardinal from a foreign country who's an extremely gifted intellectual. And I handed it to him and I said, I want you to understand, this is not a polemical book. That I wanted to describe 20th century Catholic thought. And he said, oh, that's a rarity these days, a non-polemical book. Rahner was hard to write about because he's a blindingly intelligent man when he deals with metaphysics. I'm not saying, Randy, forgive me for saying this, I'm not saying that he's right, but you read it and you say, wow, that's German brains operating there, And then, of course, there was a kind of a goofy with it side that was very, very influential in the middle of the 20s. I tried to ignore a lot of that because it won't last anyway. So, I think the thing I like the most, and I know you appreciate this, is what I did on Jacques Maritain. And I think that Maritain's story is almost emblematic of the modern recovery of Catholicism, because he comes out of, Leo XIII, everybody remembers Leo XIII for Rerum Novarum in the beginning of modern Catholic social teaching. But actually in 1879, 12 years earlier, Leo wrote an encyclical Aeterni Patris trying to recover Thomas Aquinas and encouraging thinkers to be very creative and go back and find out about Aquinas. As I was writing that book, strangely, not a lot was known about medieval philosophy, by the way. It was as the Leonine Commission was created that we began to learn about the differences between Bonaventure and Thomas and other things, and then also the rediscovery of the Church Fathers, which was quite important. But the key thing for me, and I start out with this anecdote in the book, after a poem by Charles Péguy. who, by the way, once said that a journal continues to have life only if it angers 1/4 of its readers with every issue. Justice lies in seeing that it is not always the same quarter. But here, listen to this as just an emblem for what Catholicism has to offer. Jacques and Raïssa Maritain, his wife. Raïssa was of Russian Jewish extraction. They met in Paris. They were both attending the Sorbonne. They were studying science. And one day they were walking through the Jardin des Plantes, a very beautiful park in Paris. And they said to one another, you know, the science we're studying is so bleak. This materialism is so utterly bleak. If we can't find something to live for, we'll commit suicide. They were going to commit, they had a mutual suicide pact. And through the machinations of grace, they then, I don't know if this is exactly grace, but they stumbled on the mad novelist Léon Blois, who kind of brought them into the Catholic orbit, and then Peggy. And then the rest is history. Jacques was just the most infinitely creative, philosophically, his study of art is just, I just don't understand how a man like him had those multiple gifts back in those days. His book, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, is one of those books. Michael Novak once said to me when he read it in Rome in the seminary, he had to go out every hour or so and catch his breath. It was just so breathtaking. And that's all out there. You know, it's all out there, and if we lose it, and this was also behind my desire in writing that book. If we lose all that because we get into polemics about one thing or another without at least first absorbing the just enormousness of Catholicism, then we're narrowing ourselves in sectarian ways. And the world is already sectarian enough. We don't need to narrow Catholicism, but I think one of the only ways that we're going to have answers for our world is to open ourselves up to that big tradition and to bring those tools to a world that doesn't know that it needs them, but it does need them.
Let me just add something to what Robert said. I get people writing me all the time with spiritual dilemmas and asking my advice and proposing things. And I would say a significant number of people that write me, everything that they need is in Jacques Maritain. And it's necessary for every generation to reinvent the idioms of the essay, the idioms of poetry, but you don't reinvent them from scratch. And I think that if, with our tradition has dealt with so many of the issues that we're facing right now, that the answers, or at least the foundation of the answers are there if we know about them. And I believe it's absolutely essential to be intentional about a lot of your reading. You're going to read stuff just for pleasure, for relaxation, but you should always have a list of significant books, significant authors that you're mastering. The younger you are, the longer that list should be. And if you do this with any discipline at all, you'll see in a matter of a year or two that it'll be transformational to your thinking.
Yeah, T.S. Eliot once said that Jacques Maritain's talent was limited, which was demonstrated by his life because he only revolutionized Catholic metaphysics, theology, politics, theory of education, philosophy of history, and philosophical aesthetics. So he had his limits, and natural law. Robert, I wanted to ask you one more question about the book, and my first question was to think through, or to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the philosophers and theologians whom you address in the first half of the book. But what will, for many people, be the most exciting aspect is that after you've really introduced figures of monumental importance to the intellectual life of the church, you suddenly turn to Christopher Dawson sitting on the steps in Rome and speak of the turn to culture. So tell everybody a little bit about the turn to culture, Dawson, and what you accomplish in the second half of that book.
I don't know how many of you know the story of Christopher Dawson. Dawson was an Englishman, largely self-taught, a sociologist and a historian. And he was, if you've ever been to Rome, if you go up onto the Capitol Hill, right, and you can still look down into the Roman Forum from there. That's the place where Edward Gibbon was probably, what, about 150, 200 years before Dawson, listening to the monks singing Vespers in the evening. And the idea came to him to write The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So I don't know that Dawson was a very romantic man. He was a kind of a quiet, closed-in personality, but he happened to be there as a young man and maybe reflected back on the fact that Gibbon had been there and maybe had a similar experience, but it came to him to write the history of Catholic culture. And then, of course, his whole life, took off those beautiful, beautiful books that he wrote. I've told that story to many of my friends who love going to Rome and had no idea that that's actually the case. Just a quick aside, there's also a little water fountain there that says the Aqua Marcia. This is still water that's flowing down from the old Roman aqueducts from the mountains to that place. And so it's a kind of an enchanted place. And in a way, it's kind of an image of what the faith is. The faith brought into alignment with the biblical vision, that classical, the Greco-Roman culture purified it, absorbed it, developed it in a variety of ways. And it seems to me that that's where a creative impulse comes out of. If you read Father Ian Kerr's book, the Catholic, what was it called? The English Catholic Renaissance. Yeah, the literary revival. He says in the opening chapter, he says, Cardinal Newman, writing in 1845 in the Idea of a University, and then one of the other books, he says, well, look, we always have to accept that literature in English is Protestant, not Catholic. And Kerr says, Newman was a great genius, but Hopkins hadn't written yet. And then in going into the 20th century, we'd not yet had Belloc and Chesterton, or Evelyn Waugh, or Graham Greene, or Muriel Spark, or here in the United States, Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy and Thomas Merton and many others. So even as brilliant a man as Newman was in the middle of the 19th century, could look around and say, there's just no possibility of there being an English. He even uses the phrase, he says at one point, this is not a time of great authors, it's a time of good writing. Well, that's just at the point where it's going to explode. And then there are, of course, many other minor figures, Coventry Patmore and Siegfried Sassoon. And, you can't predict where the spirit is going to go.
And that's also why artists can't look to the clergy for direction.
I get passionate about this subject because I spent so much time with these people that I admire so very much and have learned so much from and been formed by. And I think we just have an obligation to this. There's a reason why, look, not every poet, of course, has to be Dante. In fact, I would advise you, maybe Dana would just be ambitious, but don't expect to be Dante. But Dante was fortunate that he came at a particular moment. You'd had the scholastic revival, He studied with a student of St. Thomas Aquinas's. Remigio de Girolami was his name. He studied with the Franciscans. He had the advantage of courtly love poetry. And then he also had the advantage of nuptial mysticism. So when he says in Purgatory, a fellow Italian poet says to him, well, what made you so different? He says, io mi son uno, che quando amor mi ispira noto, e a quel modo che dita dentro vo significato. He says, and it's really, in Italian, it's kind of forceful. I'm the kind of guy that when love inspires me, I take notice of it. And in the mode that it speaks to me is the way I write. Beautiful stuff, right? You don't have to be as informed and as intellectual as a Dante to be, even a great poet, I would say, because there's all kinds of poetry, and these guys are writing it. It's wonderful stuff. But we all have an obligation because God has given us this tradition. And for those of us fortunate enough to be able at this time and place to read back into it, and we've got, you take out your smartphone and I'll point you toward where the Summa Theologia is, and all the church fathers and all Greek and Latin pagan writers. We have enormous resources. And to me, it seems we have an obligation to make use of them, and particularly as Catholics, because we're the ones who really do believe that our church is universal, and universal for all people, not just people who identify as Catholic.
In the book, you demonstrate that in a particular way. It's quite common for people to choose streams within the Catholic literary revival, the French novelists Graham Greene and Waugh, or Tolkien. And yet, as I recall reading through A Deeper Vision, as I was reading about Waugh, I was coming to understand the Sword of Honor trilogy better than I ever had before. And then I was reading Lord of the Rings to my oldest kids as I came upon your chapter, and it was so good because I was able to point out to them, what was it, Annunciation Day, and everything. And, so it was really helpful to actually. I was learning so much about what I was trying to share with my kids as we were going through the book. Speaking of which, talking about sharing the arts with your family, Dana, you, as we were talking about the other day, come from, at least between you and your brother Ted, an unusually talented family. You have, for a brother, one of the great jazz historians of our age. And you yourself have a fluency, which I've witnessed in both the visual and the plastic arts, and in opera and classical music that would be the envy of many people. And I will just share this one brief anecdote. I once was walking through a museum with Dana, and he described every piece, told me what it was worth, told me which museums had other holdings by the artist. And I don't think there was one detail that was left out. It was really quite magnificent. So what I wanted to ask is, since with such a life of encountering beauty, can you share with us tonight one specific encounter that was particularly transformative?
I could share many. I'll just give you a more recent example. About 20 years ago, there was a large, beautiful orchestral cantata based on my poetry. It was for full orchestra, chorus, and singers by Elva Henderson. It was called Winter Requiem. And it was being premiered in San Jose and then taken up to San Francisco. So I went to the dress rehearsal. It's nice to hear a new piece without an audience, and then you're prepared for it at the premiere. And it was very beautiful. But there was a second piece on the program called Lux Aeterna by a composer whose name I had heard of, but I had never heard a note of his music. And I say that because I am a fanboy of contemporary American music. I mean, I listen to it all the time. I read the critics on it all the time. Don't like much of it, but I look for the pieces and I love it. So didn't know what to expect, and I heard that performed. And you have to understand there's a competitive element, here. You don't want to prefer the piece that's being performed next to your piece, and it was simply a masterpiece. I heard it then the following night at the premiere at the Cathedral of St. Joseph in San Jose, and I said to myself, "This is the best new piece of American music I've heard for 20 years, maybe 30 years." And then 2 nights later, I heard it at St. Ignatius in San Francisco for a third time. And I decided to write the composer a letter. Now that letter ended up in many ways changing my life in unexpected and significant ways. But what this did, and I had the same experience when I first heard Arvo Pärt's Fratres, is I was in despair at the state of culture, just the crap, the in some cases the aggressive awfulness of pieces. It's in many cases aesthetically or ideologically driven, and yet suddenly I am hearing a piece that you could put next to Mozart and would not suffer by comparison. And I said to myself, it is possible to do great work now, and we have no excuses from despair, no excuses that the society won't recognize it. Let me add not a personal, but a general footnote to that. Insofar as I know, with the exception of Eric Gibson at the Wall Street Journal, who is convinced that Lauritsen is the greatest living American composer, he has never been acknowledged by the New York musical press, which is essentially the classical music press of America. Nonetheless, I suspect he's probably the most frequently performed living American composer. He's performed because when singers sing his work, they tell other singers, they tell choir masters, and it's beauty being recognized by practicing artists who are not part of the ruling elite, bringing it up from the bottom rather than being dictated down from the south. And that gives me hope. The fact that the sheet music of O Magnum Mysterium 20 years ago had sold 1 million copies gives me hope for the future, because it means people recognize the genuine article when they hear it.
That I can readily believe that's true, because in my entire adult life, the only time that choral music has been playing and someone has turned to me and said, "Oh, is that Morton Lauridsen?" That's the only such composer that has gotten that recognition. Your last comment there brings us actually to the next question for either of you, for both of you, and that is, what is the most important next thing Catholics in general, Catholic writers and intellectuals can do for our culture? What's most needed now?
We have to change it, right? We have to transform this culture, which means that we have to prepare ourselves into people who can transform it. And that's intellectual, it's social, and eventually creative or critical. So I think what we need to do, and it's really just an elaboration of something Robert said. Christ called all humanity to salvation. Catholicism is the universal religion. If you only know the Catholic art that's been created in America or England, you don't know the Catholic culture. If you were going to say, well, I know everything about Catholic American painting, I'm sorry for you. And so you would never say that, because you would miss El Greco and Michelangelo and Matthias Grunewald, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need, in a sense, I think, for writers, that's the people in this room, to be as international as the people studying art or music. And my sense, from talking to several thousand at this point, young Catholic writers and young Catholic teachers, is that we are a narrowly Anglophonic group who basically prefers cozy British fiction. Give me Chesterton and Tolkien, and C.S. Lewis was Catholic, wasn't he? And we have this we're doing it as comfort food. And then you add a little spice with Graham Greene, you know, a little evil pleasure with Evelyn Waugh. But most of us are ignorant of what Catholic literature really is. If you asked me, and I don't know what Robert's answer would be, what is the greatest single Catholic novel? I want to see a show of hands of who's read it. Now, you may disagree with me, but it's I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni. So we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Cynthia Haven is vacillating. I think she got halfway through the book.
I must interrupt because a year from now, every hand in this room will be up because it's required in our program.
Good. Yeah. Well, I remember emphasizing that to you guys, but you'll find that most Catholics have not read it. And the same thing as who is the greatest Catholic poet of the 20th century? You know my nomination because I think it's been pressed on you, is Mario Luzzi. I know John Paul II felt the same way, but once again, almost unread here. And you can go on, country by country. And I wonder how many of you have read to your children Giovanni Guareschi's Stories of Don Camillo. In a sense, for popular, charming, witty Catholic fiction, these stories of a village priest who has in a town with a communist mayor who's trying, little story by little story. It's almost parables. And they were immensely popular. They were made into 11 movies in the 50s and 60s. And they were so popular, they were filmed simultaneously in French and Italian and then dubbed into English. But he's vanished. And yet people are, they like, C.S. Lewis. And we have this wonderful, Jesus is the third character, by the way, the third most important character in this. But we have all these things that we've lost touch with. Those are just 3 Italian ones. Robert's named some, French ones. The Spanish writers, Scandinavian writers. We have this really rich international tradition, and it's very simple. Ezra Pound said, "You can't really learn to write poetry if you only read English, because you don't have people in English." In a sense, doing something better than anybody else. And he begins to, just go poet by poet, the different poets can teach you. And it's the same thing in literature, different perspectives. When you read Manzoni, you realize there's, it's this epic, vision of society, which includes, everything in reality. It's epic in the sense that it fits everything in a culture in a certain moment. But that's what I would emphasize, is to be international. You can't read everything. You can't read everything in the original language, but you can sort of make a list of saying, these are things that I've got to take a look at. And you may not like something, but then you go on, next, but you will find it transformative. I mean, it's, the René Girard. Look at the books that in a sense gave him the insight that became, I think, this sort of transformational philosophy. It wasn't the theologians, it wasn't the philosophers, it was Stendhal. It was, watching Julien Sorel trying to seduce his boss's daughter. And that's what became Deceit and Desire in the novel, and eventually developed his whole mimetic theory.
Bob, your thoughts?
Well, this is utterly unhelpful, but I think we need everything at once. I mean, we need strict intellectual cultivation. Maybe because I write on the more expository side, I think we need tremendously powerful images. At a time when people aren't very logical, they absorb all kinds of ideas through imagery. And as we know, between television, films, internet, God help us. Although the Catholic thing's on the internet. Images can convey some things that logical argument cannot. I mean, it's knowledge carried to the heart, as Cardinal Newman said. So I think we have to do everything at once. And I just say this, and that's unhelpful, of course, since you've mentioned Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound once said about the Catholic Church, he said, an institution that could survive the picturesqueness of the Borgias has a certain native resilience to it. Right? So we shouldn't despair. And when I think, how many of you have seen the movie The Third Man? Does anybody watch that anymore? Yeah. Well, this used to be a very popular film. And almost, 10 or 15 years ago, almost everybody would have said yes. This is a film that's based on one of Graham Greene's entertainments. It's set in Vienna after World War II, and an American novelist, or fiction writer at least, played by Joseph Cotten, goes to Vienna, and he's looking for his friend Harry Lime, who's disappeared. And Harry Lime is Orson Welles, the great actor and movie producer. And so he finds him, and they're on this Ferris wheel. It's in Vienna. I'm going to be in Vienna 2 days, by the way. And they're having this conversation, and the American novelist finds out that Harry Lime has been diluting, watering down the penicillin that people need after the war to, respond to infections. Children are dying and whatnot, and he thinks it's utterly unscrupulous. And there's this famous dialogue that Orson Welles inserted into the book by Graham Greene, in which he says, this is quite hilarious. He says, the Italians for 30 years under the Borgias had murder and torture and rapine and destruction. And what did they produce? They produced Michelangelo, they produced Leonardo da Vinci, and they produced the Renaissance. He says, for 500 years, the Swiss had peace and democracy and brotherhood. And what did they produce? The cuckoo clock. Now, Harry is an unscrupulous character, and he's rationalizing his own behavior. But, if we can survive the picturesqueness of the Borgias, we can even probably survive American culture. Don't you think? So, I would just go at everything full bore at once. Study. If you're a creative writer, also study. If you're a philosopher, theologian, scripture scholar, read literature. This is one of the things I learned when we were doing our Fides et Ratio seminars, that if you asked many of the scripture people, have you ever read Promessi Sposi? What is that? Have you ever read such and such a poet? Oh, no. We're Catholic. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we can do a lot more as well.
Let me add another comment to what Robert was saying. Is that this group is all different ages. It's from all over the country, but every one of you should walk away from this program with a project. And I don't mean just the reading project or your degree, but you should be deciding to create a magazine, to create a website, to do some, do video or films or, on YouTube, basically to get the ideas and the work out there. Look at what Joshua did with nothing. He had nothing but the vocation to do it. And he has, in a period of relatively few years, created a significant addition to Catholic literary culture. Look at what James is doing in terms of his press and his conference. And you can make a difference. Christ changed the world with 12 people, one of whom left. They were not trained for the job. They were manual laborers, tax collectors, a motley crew if ever there was one. It doesn't take that many people. What it takes is intelligence and dedication, and I think a common cause. If you could make common cause, if you could, help. Cynthia Haven has written 4 significant books in the last 3 years while holding down another job with very little support. You can do it if there is the will. Okay, but that's different news. He's saying she wrote 6 books, but you know, okay, well, all the better. We would have to talk about the time frame. Sarah Cortez is, creating a project for school kids. If we had coming out of this room, 40 projects, that would have a tangible impact. Plus, helping one another create a magazine, create an online magazine. I can't predict the projects. Kwong is young. He's going to see the world differently from the way I do it. And so that's what you've got to do. You've got to take your work into the world, and you have to form a cohort. Together, you have a significant amount of influence. Individually, you have much less. And James and Joshua, have created, in a sense, a context for you to transform your individual lives. Everyone in this room, even if they don't want to help you, know that God has asked them to help you. We have no choice about it. And so, so that's what I would call you to recognize the vocation. You wouldn't be here if you weren't called to be here. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have some work to do. Wisdom is to recognize what that is and get working, and once again, to make common cause.
Let me just add one point about that. I hear it from people all the time. If it wasn't for the Catholic thing, I'd be going crazy. The additional point I would make to what Dana just said is network as well, support one another. One of the discoveries, I think, of the 20th century was personalism. Maritain was involved in this. Some of the phenomenologists were involved with this. And people are not born as a Cartesian cogito, or Rousseau's, we're all born free and now we're all in chains. No, you're born in a family. You're born among people who teach you how to speak. They teach you your religion. You're born into a community. And I think one of the reasons that we have kind of these nutty forms of race, class, and gender as identity markers, I know you don't like the word identity, but it's out there, of course. There are legitimate things to talk about in terms of those three. But the normal way that people used to understand themselves in the world is through family, their religion, and through their community. And so we find ourselves, you're all going to go back, I assume, to different parts of the country, but we find ourselves somewhat isolated, somewhat fragmented. But we do have this ambivalent thing that we call the internet, and we can be in contact with one another on a regular basis. And don't neglect that. Don't neglect it for your own sake, because you do need support and feedback from other people. But if you start to create something, when we created the Catholic thing, my great research assistant, Jason Buffetti, who works for the National Endowment for Humanities now, came to me one day and he said, we have to start a blog. I said, that's an ugly word. What is a blog? We started, I think it was 14 years ago. I had no idea what it was. And I said, well, what is it? He says, well, we put stuff up online. I said, yeah. And he said, and then people read it. I said, oh, really? I said, well, how do we get them there? And he said, well, we have a reading list of, we have a mailing list of 2,000, 3,000 people, whatever it was. And we now have 50,000 subscribers. And I mean passionate subscribers, generous subscribers too. So be bold, put it out there. There are many new things that are waiting to be created. And I'm entirely with Dana. There's a reason why you're all here, and it's just a matter of discovering that and being faithful to it.
One more sentence. For everybody here, personally know 2 or 3 people each who are Catholic but are kind of afraid to step forward and do it. You will inspire other people.
As Dana and Bob just mentioned, we are honored to have among us tonight Cynthia Haven, who just 2 nights from now is going to be lecturing to us on the Nobel laureate, the great Polish poet and defector from communism, Czesław Miłosz. let me just remind people of the schedule for the literary series. Tomorrow night, Robert Royal will join us again to lecture on the poetry of John Paul II. And then the night after that, Cynthia will be with us to lecture on Czeslaw Milosz. I really wanted to ask you two both to just offer a few thoughts on Czeslaw, but I'm not going to, because I promised that I would open questions up for just one or two questions to the audience. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll call on you and I'll repeat the question. Yeah, Stephanie. About the concept of my truth versus the truth.
It's a simple philosophical error. Let's say, so if there's your truth and my truth, is it true that there's only individual truth? I mean, there's got to be a fundamental truth underneath the my truth versus your truth. I think this is a dodge. Look, in democratic societies, we're always coming up against people who are quite a bit different than we are, and we try to minimize tensions when we meet each other. But look, if someone comes up to you and says, you know, my truth is that racism is okay, is everybody in this room and outside in America going to say, oh yeah, that's right, that's just your truth, that's fine? No, there are obvious moral truths that are universal. And I think that Catholics can argue beyond the most obvious things that exist in the United States right now, but it's a good question to bring up.
Another? Timothy. How have you gone about deciding who should make your list of important authors to read?
Obviously, you read someone. At a very impressionable age, I read The ABCs of Reading by Ezra Pound. And he gives you years worth of reading. And Pound, that book still strikes me as one of the very best books ever written on literature. And in fact, in that book, Ezra Pound invents the blog. You know, that people didn't know what it was yet, but if you read that book, you'll see it's the perfection of blog English happened, you know, over 100 years ago. And I said, well, I've got to learn French. I've got to learn standard Italian because I only know a dialect. I got to keep my Latin up. And I began to read those authors, and it shaped, and then they read others. So the recommendations of the people you respect and gain wisdom and pleasure from are the next possible things. But remember also that, as Oscar Wilde said, only the auctioneer can appreciate all schools of art. You will find some people you prefer to others, and they'll lead on. But it's a natural path. But I'm asking you to accelerate that natural path and to choose higher goals. So I think that the most pernicious thing that literary theory did, and that's a big list of possible bad things. I think the worst thing it did was gave the last 40 years of graduate students excuses not to read primary texts, but to say, well, if I read this book, then suddenly I don't have to read those 100 books. And so we've produced in the academy essentially illiterate faculty. And you know, anybody, you know, I don't think anybody is going to debate that except perhaps the faculty at St. Thomas if they're in the room. But you know, but there's still people that are good. But by and large, the graduate students, the junior faculty, have not even read most of the primary texts in their own field. It's shocking to say, but it's true. But we have to aspire to a higher level of thing, and just, you already have a list in your head. You've had things that are recommended, and you just start it. Sometimes you won't like it, you won't finish it, but you should always be reading a book that broadens your historical and your aesthetic perspective.
I think with that, again, I want to remind you, we'll be back here tomorrow night to hear Robert Rules. Oh, can you handle a couple more? All right. I know people on the live stream who were staying up for this and really want to go to bed, but okay.
There's some people probably in the audience whose hands are shaking, waiting for the reception, but
yeah. Okay. I've asked two poets, John. I'm sorry. Patrick, we need a fiction writer. Can you provide an elevator pitch for your description of what is Catholic literature? An elevator pitch for Catholic letters.
I think I did it in a pretty good paragraph in the Catholic Writer today. And there's different ways of defining what it is, but I think that Catholic literature is the product of believing Catholics using literary media to tell their stories and account for reality. I don't believe in identity politics for this, but if it's essentially it's writing from the inside. Now there's four kinds. There's people that are believers, there's people that are on the brink, but usually have a Catholic formation. There's people who have the Catholic formation and have left it, and there's anti-Catholic Catholics. I think all four of those things comprise Catholic literature. What interests me most is the first two categories, though the last is pretty interesting. The third one tends to be negligible. They're usually teaching somewhere, and and it's no longer profitable to be Catholic, so they've given it up. But it really comes from belief in or familiarity or immersion with the worldview as a feasible account of reality.
So that was too long, Robert.
This would be entirely unhelpful, but I know it when I see it.
That was short enough. Okay. Those answers were concise. Apologies to Dana. Enough that we have time for one more question. Yes, up high there, Ryan.
To a certain extent, you're kind of preaching to the choir here, and everybody who's here tonight and listen to this already sort of has an appreciation for writing or art or something along those lines. Maybe I'm also asking for an elevator pitch, but more of one for the larger Catholic world, businessmen, other normal people, but who might not value the same things and sort of elevator pitch to make them.
See, an elevator pitch depends on what you're pitching. It's not a definition. So if I'm talking about, I don't preach to people about being Catholic. I let people know I'm Catholic, and I try to lead a life that's an example of why you want to be a Catholic, that you're joyful and you're active and you're committed. And it's the example that speaks, most eloquently. And when they ask me about it, I say that I was raised a Catholic, so that I have that background. But the reason that I've continued to be a Catholic is that the Catholic account of reality is consistent with my own experience. And following a Catholic life, I've learned has two advantages of making me less bad and happier, more joyful. And many people I know aren't joyful. They don't feel productive. They don't feel that they can understand the world around them. So, but your example will speak more loudly than your words. But the reason we're preaching to the choir is you guys are done being choir boys and choir girls. You got to go out and you got to be composers and conductors. You've got to lead your own group, and you've got to suddenly step from the choir into a solo position and speak to the world. That's why you're here. You're sick of being in the damn choir. The choir robes don't fit anymore.
I don't know what normal people are because I've never met any myself. But, look, you have to create an audience. You know, it's one of the complaints, of course, about modern art in general, that there's been a disconnect between, you know, larger mass populations and what looks like an elite practice of whatever intellectual or artistic activity you're involved in. But people were made by God in a certain way, and they need him. When Thomas Merton wrote The Seven-Story Mountain in the 1940s after World War II, he was selling, if I remember this right, 50,000 copies a week. Now, we've all written books, and I can tell you, if any of us were selling 50,000 copies of anything a week, that would be a miracle, you know, like changing wine into water. It's just, it doesn't happen.
There was no commercial category of Trappist memoir.
Right. And it was because people were hungry after World War II, after they'd seen the horrors of World War II, and their lives, they were looking for something, and he was it. I mean, he's a great writer on top of everything else. But you can't assume that there's, you know, there ought to be a category out there that you're going to just capture. You create it by the energy that you put out into there. So whatever form that you're going into, and I can't agree with Dana enough, that go out with a project and try something. And if it doesn't work, try something else. And if that doesn't work, try something else again. You know, in business, what do they say about small businesses? 90% of them fail in the first year, but people keep going and eventually they succeed with something. We have so many needs. There are so many opportunities right now that if you stay at this, it's inevitable that a large number of these things will eventually succeed because people, whether they know it or not, need to hear the good news.
Totalitarian societies have to constantly repeat the lies. It has to, you know, be blasting in the speakers, on the paper, because people won't see that in reality. They have to be told that's the reality. And they also understand the danger of a single person whispering the truth. Because when you say the truth, people recognize it as such, even if they have been afraid to acknowledge it. And that is our strength, is that, you know, as Robert says, that we have, our faith gives us the real account of existence. And if we're able to speak it clearly in a society which has lost that account, magna est veritas. Truth is great. You may be attacked, you may be ignored, but it's much more powerful than simply repeating the conventional lies of the moment.
So what you're telling us is that an opportunity would be created if, as it was for Merton, there were great catastrophes and the times were troubled, and if there were increasingly the threat of encroaching totalitarian regimes. But what are the chances of any of that happening?
We got troubles aplenty.
That was originally my second question tonight, was what are the great challenge posed to us? But I guess I've gotten my answer without even having to pose the question. Just one last question from the audience. Yes. How do we get people who would otherwise be addled by YouTube personalities and other social media influencers to encounter something a little bit more serious and transformative?
We need another Evelyn Waugh, because if you read some of those black comedies of Evelyn Waugh during, you know, the period between World War I and World War II, he really just skewers what the culture has become. And in many ways, we have that same frivolity, you know, that exists right now. But people, you can't live forever on a diet of Twitter and Instagram. I mean, I have at least that much faith in human nature, fallen human nature, right? So there's going to be something else that happens. And the phrase that comes to mind is there's a chapter, the title of a chapter in Brideshead Revisited called A Twitch on a Thread. There's this little something that gets picked. But if people don't hear it, and if it's not in circulation around them so that somehow that they can encounter it, it'll never happen. They'll never have that encounter. I mean, the opportunities are so wide, and just there needs to be real imagination, not only in the creation, but I think also in the presentation of things there. And then the normal, I mean, there's always going to be a fallen world. It's not going to be perfect until the second coming, but there are manifold ways to use energies, and God has ideas for people.
Let me answer it in a different way. I'll tell you the reason we are most likely to fail. We're most likely to fail because Catholics, because of our training, because of our legacy, have an almost uncontrollable desire to philosophize, to turn things into abstract systems, and to bring it up to a level of conceptual thought. And your question is that you're saying, like, what's the formula that we can take that's going to work? And the answer is there isn't. Robert answered, by saying you're going to write a novel as good as Evelyn Law. You are going to, or not going to, write a joke that's so funny, people are going to remember it, remind them of an uncomfortable truth. Write a song so beautiful that it's going to make people reconsider things. Write a poem so persuasive that it transcends ideology. Write a story so memorable, so striking that it will suddenly give people an epiphany about a certain part of experience. We must do this effectively to do it in what Maritain calls the poetic imagination, the poetic medium, where things are embodied as stories, as songs, as shapes, the thing of an image. And that's what I think you're called to do, or you're called to teach that existing in the culture, or you're to talk about it. But unless we're able to create another generation of compelling stories and songs and poems and plays and music and paintings and sculpture, we're lost, because we have ceded the imagination to the commercial popular culture. And you know what that is. But a story is more powerful than any explanation of a story. A poem is more powerful than a critique of it. So that's what we have to do, is we have to learn to speak in the poetic imagination, as Maritain puts it.
So please, go out tonight, imagine, make, found, do, fail, because there's no formula. But before you do all of that, please thank our speakers tonight. And you may not have noticed, but there are concessions to be found up in the lobby.